Payment for environmental services, identifying and seizing the right opportunities for your business. This has certainly been a dynamic time for water issues in the state of Florida. I don't think there's been these many issues on the front page of the newspaper dealing with water since probably 40 years ago when we first formed the water management districts. Whether it's dealing with water supply and quality issues affecting Florida's springs and rivers from the Panhandle to North and Central Florida, or water supply and quality issues to meet the future needs of the Central Florida region encompassed within the Central Florida Water Initiative geographic region, or most recently the discharges of slugs of fresh water from Lake Okeechobee and the sea canals in South Florida causing havoc along the estuarine coastal environment. Who here hasn't seen a headline announcing the march of the blue-green algae to devastate our coastal areas? There has been some critical water issue that has affected every part of our state. But thankfully, we also have leaders in the state who take on these challenges, take them head on, and are being proactive in their steps to try to address each. Many of these proactive steps and innovative programs may be found in the landmark water bill, SB 552, passed this past year and signed into law by the governor earlier this year. Many of you know last year it didn't come out of the legislature, but this year it was the first thing that went through and thankfully went through and was signed before we got into some of the more controversial issues. It's more like a Water Resource Development Act bill in the federal law than the typical piecemeal water legislation we've had in Florida. This law is comprehensive and addresses issues from the Georgia line to the Keys. Now the challenge is how to implement it. We have assembled one of the finest collections of water experts in the state. Over the next 90 minutes, we'll address many of these programs authorized by the water bill, along with programs being implemented by FDEP and the water management districts to address the various water challenges. And last, we'll have an overview of the tax consequences a landowner will likely incur if they participate in these programs. Our first presentation, we'll start with the innovative multi-district regional planning effort known as Central Florida Water Initiative, CFWI. Our first speaker is Brian Armstrong. Brian is the newly appointed Executive Director of Southwest Florida Water Management District since June of this year. Yeah. Our condolences, one or two. Brian has his degrees from USF. He has a BS in geology, and that BS is for Bachelor of Science, and has his master's in hydrology. He spent 15 years undertaking water resource management with FDEP, bracketed by tours of duty at Southwest Florida Water Management District, where he rose up through the ranks to Assistant Executive Director before assuming the position as Executive Director earlier this year. He was also district's point person on the development of the Polk County Regional Water Cooperative. Brian? Wherever you'd be comfortable.
Yep, ready to go. Good afternoon again, Brian Armstrong. I understand that this panel stands in between you and cocktails, so I will stick to my prescribed 10 minutes. But I know most of you are familiar with the Central Florida Water Initiative, so I'm going to do this at about a 30,000 foot level for those who aren't familiar, and most of you hopefully will consider this a refresher. Just to locate you geographically, the area you see shaded there is the Central Florida Water Initiative area. It includes parts of all of Polk, Osceola, Orange, Seminole, and Lake counties. What started CFWI was water resource concerns. Within that shaded area, there's already water resource features that aren't meeting their minimum flows and levels at the current pumping levels. And a model was developed that said if you pump everything that's currently permitted, the 1.1 billion gallons you see at the top of that cylinder, that number of MFLs not meeting is probably going to double or triple. So, of course, we can't allow that to happen. Currently, there's about 800 million gallons per day of the 1.1 billion being pumped. The model says there's maybe 50 MGD of upper Florida groundwater left, but the location of that and those withdrawals are very important. So the question is, where do you get the 250? Where do you get the deficit in what's permitted and what's available according to the science? CFWI started off with developing what's called a regional water supply plan. We all have individual regional water supply plans, but this is the first time we've come together under the direction of the governor and the Secretary of DEP to actually put one together, work together to have your first multi-district regional water supply plan, and I can thankfully say that was accomplished. But one of the great accomplishments out of that plan was that it identified enough projects to meet and far exceed that 250 million gallons per day. But they wanted to take it a step further. They wanted to do a little more investigation of some of these projects, and they took an additional set of those and did what was called the solutions plan, where they looked at more costing, more feasibility, and the actual ability to develop these projects. And what they did is they kind of put the currently top 20 together, which were approved by the steering committee, and these will be the first initial projects lobbied for funding if it is available. And what we plan on doing next is that model that I described that kind of delineated how much water was available. You know, it had a couple of outstanding issues, like the boundaries were too close within Polk County. So they're revising that model, and they're expanding the boundaries coast to coast, so you don't run into what we refer to as boundary condition issues. So the model is going to be updated by the end of next year. And then all these other things are what we're working on as far as the water resource planning. One of the big ones that sticks out is that consistent rules, develop consistent rules. And then lastly, all these things are going to roll into a new regional water supply plan that will be updated every 5 years and completed by 2020. In the Southwest Florida Water Management District, we took it an extra step. Mike mentioned the Polk Water Cooperative. We've had a lot of success. This isn't new for the Southwest Florida Water Management District. Many of you may have been around when we were experiencing what most have referred to as the water wars in the Tampa Bay area. There was a lot of money spent for many years on litigation in the tens of millions of dollars. Sad fact is nothing got built and nothing went towards solving the problem. And we entered into what was called the partnership agreement. And we have really moved to funding and trying to solve problems through regional water supply authorities, especially on the utility side. So we marched down that path again in helping form the Polk Water Cooperative. If you've ever worked with a utility, they're opinionated, and when you put 16 of them in a room, they all have their great ideas, and they all don't match all the time. So this was worse than herding cats, to be honest with you, but it was amazing that it was done. You now have 16 municipalities within the county that now, under one cooperative, are going to look to develop their sources together. And these large alternative water supply projects are expensive. So when you can put them together and create one large project, you get economy of scale, and you get better bonding and things of that nature. So hopefully, that is the intent of creating this water cooperative. But it took a big carrot. So we set out these things that were benchmarks, and we said, listen, if you begin this effort and you study these certain projects further, we'll put $10 million out there for you. And then if you form your cooperative and you get everybody joined, we'll put another $10 million out for you. And then if you identify 30 MGD worth of projects by next April, at the end of the day, we're going to have $40 million of cost share money sitting for the cooperative if you can get all these milestones done by April of next year. They have met everyone so far. All we're waiting for now is the 30 million gallons per day of an alternative source by April 2017. So what I was asked to talk about, CFWI and the water bill. You know, the good news here is that a lot of things that were required in the bill, we've done. It had to be a collaborative process, check. Single regional water supply plan, we've not only completed that, we've already begun work on the next one, check. The model, we're working on refining the existing model, so that's done. Obviously, we have a water supply planning program. And then uniform permitting rules, no check there, but we're in the process. Now, let me spend a little time on that uniform permitting rules because it seems really simple, but it asks for a lot. And one of the biggest things it's asked for is one single definition of harm, right? Harm to the water resource. That's where an MFL is set. And I already said some of them aren't being met. My definition and the definition down south are all different. Two of them are pretty close, one's not really, but we're required to come up with one definition of harm, what we set these MFLs to. It also requires us to come up with one single way of determining per capita, because that's the big number in the utilities, right? We have to determine how much we think people are going to use so you can plan the water resources and permit to that. We have to come up with one permitting process. We all have 3 different handbooks on how to get a permit. We need to find and put together in the CFWI one handbook or one approach to permitting. One approach to MFLs, if you can imagine, the 3 of us do that a little differently as well. Within the CFWI, we're being required to do that. One, for each permit, you have to have a permitting per capita goal in every permit we issue. You also have to come up with a conservation plan for each permit. It does take into an exception, is it says if there's an existing water supply recovery plan, and for my district and most of Polk County, that's called the Southern Water Use Caution Area, it allows us to maintain those rules in that recovery plan within that area. And then lastly, so we don't sit on our hands and never get to it, they set a time limit. They said, by the end of this year, you need to initiate rulemaking to make these changes. So the water bill really put an emphasis on, yes, CFWI is important, and we want action. Now, some of the things that also are in the water bill that I thought you may find interesting is water use monitoring. Any permit over 100,000 gallons per day will require monitoring at least annually. My district's been doing it for years, and we require monthly permit, but this will be new for some of the other districts. Priority for public and private partnerships. You will get a lot of, someone's doing a presentation on this, but what it does is it encourages the water management districts to look for opportunities with ag lands for water storage, for groundwater recharge, and water quality treatment. That is encouraged within the water bill. Water conservation incentives. This one's pretty neat. It says if a permittee is below their permitted quantities and they're going above and beyond what's required in conservation, the water management districts cannot reduce their permit allocation during that permit period for them saving the conserved water. Protect agricultural quantities. This one's really good. It's the same concept. We can't reduce the allocation, the permitted allocations during the term of the permit if for reasons of weather, nursery, supply limitations, disease, market conditions, or change in crop type. So it protects those agricultural quantities. And the next one, adopt MFLs for outstanding Florida springs. We're required to do that. For us, we have 2 left, and we plan on adopting those by the required date of June 2017. And then this one is really interesting. ID priority focus areas. These are areas, spring sheds, spring areas that aren't meeting their MFL. And in these areas, the DEP is charged with delineating these priority focus areas. What you really should focus on there is there's a lot of shall nots once these areas are identified. One of the shall nots, there's a lot of restrictions on new domestic wastewater facilities within these areas, new on-site systems for properties less than 1 acre, biosolid spreading, restrictions on new hazardous waste facilities, and most importantly for you folks, new ag operations that don't prescribe or practice BMPs. And then lastly, competing applications. It did weigh in on competing applications. Most importantly, it said if there's two applications and one's a renewal, the renewal will take precedence over the new application. And then in the case where maybe they're both new applications and one is not a renewal, the application that is closest, the source that is closest to who it's being delivered to will take precedence over the other one. And with that, I think I kept to my 10 minutes.
Any questions for Brian? We're going to go ahead and do Q&A after each presentation since we're rotating our speakers. Yes.
So Brian, I think within the ag production community, there's a little bit of a misperception of conservation versus efficient irrigation use. And if you have a grower who's conserving as much as possible, then we may need to look at their efficiencies, particularly when you're looking at cost share programs. So do you see that as something coming down the pipe?
Efficiency is part of I don't know, most may not be familiar with my district, and I can't speak to each of them. We have what's called the FARMS program, Facilitating Agricultural Resource Management, which we do cost share many efficiency, soil moisture sensors, rain sensors, telemetry, things of that nature, microjet projects, tailwater recovery. So within my district, we already look at those as conservation efficiencies, and we cost share them. Now, depending on where they are and what they do, so if it's water quantity only, we cost share 50%. If it has a water quantity and water quality component, we cost share 75%. And if it's water quality only within the MIA, which stands for our most impacted area, we recently made a decision, our governing board approved us to cost share any project 75% within that area.
So do you see that starting to expand through the other, area here of the CFWI, since there is St. John's and other?
And South, I can't speak to them. I know you'll get one of them here that you can ask that question later, but they do also have agricultural cost share programs. I'm looking for a nod, yes. And Jeff, you were down south, right? And you have?
I was.
And you have
He was down
agricultural
south.
cost share programs?
We do not.
They do not, down south right now, currently have it.
Our pesky Everglades, the store takes all our money.
And you'll be around through the reception afterwards
Yeah,
if people
very
have questions further? Thank you. Thank you so
Thank you.
much. Appreciate it.